Your home was a carefully decorated death trap, and your ancestors had no idea. 42 things they did every single day that would make a modern health inspector quit on the spot starting now. 1. You probably picture Victorian wallpaper as bold, dramatic, and sophisticated, the crown jewel of a well-appointed room. Emerald green was the shade everyone wanted, a color so fashionable it appeared in parlors, bedrooms, and nurseries across the country. Here is what nobody in that parlor knew. That gorgeous green was arsenite of copper, a pigment so laced with arsenic that the walls themselves were slowly gassing the family to death. When the paste behind the wallpaper grew damp, and in Britain's climate, it always grew damp, mold colonies formed, metabolized the arsenic, and released trimethylarsine gas directly into the room. The family sleeping inside would develop fatigue, nausea, and neurological damage that physicians blamed on moral weakness or bad air, never once suspecting the beautifully patterned walls surrounding them. Manufacturers understood the risk by the 1860s. The industry lobbied aggressively against regulation for decades anyway because the color was profitable and the dyeing was slow enough to be deniable. Arsenic showed up not just in wallpaper but in candles, fabrics, and the artificial flowers decorating every surface of the room. The Victorians decorated their homes the way someone might hang a carbon monoxide detector upside down and frame it as art. Technically present, completely useless, and lethal at a pace nobody noticed until it was well past the point of doing anything about it. 2. The Victorian hearth was the heart of the home, the gathering point, the source of warmth, the romantic centerpiece of domestic life. Painters loved it, poets wrote about it. The families sitting directly in front of it were inhaling coal smoke, soot particles, and sulfur dioxide every single evening while calling it comfortable. Coal became the dominant domestic fuel in Britain by the mid-19th century, and virtually no homes had any meaningful chimney ventilation standards. Chronic respiratory disease was so common in industrial cities that it was considered a normal feature of urban life rather than a medical emergency worth investigating. Soot-coated walls, furniture, food, and lung tissue simultaneously. Victorian households scrubbed soot as a weekly chore, the way modern households vacuum. Not because it was alarming, but because it was simply the texture of daily existence. And then there were the children employed as chimney sweeps, whose scrotal cancer rates were documented by Surgeon Percival Pott in 1775, making it the first occupational cancer ever formally identified in medical history. The same industry that romanticized the fireplace as a symbol of family warmth was simultaneously creating a documented cancer cluster among the children it sent to maintain it. The Victorian fireplace was less a comfort and more a slow subscription service for respiratory damage, one the entire family had signed up for without reading a single word of the terms and conditions. 3. The Victorian bedroom was the most intimate, protected space in the house, a refuge, a sanctuary. It was also where the chamber pot lived, sitting open under the bed or inside a bedside cabinet until morning, sometimes until midday, containing everything the household had produced overnight. Indoor plumbing was not widespread in working and middle-class homes until the very late Victorian era. The chamber pot was the standard solution, and it was nobody's idea of a great time. The contents were emptied each morning by servants into a slop pail, which was then carried through the house before disposal, through the hallway, past the dining room, occasionally through the kitchen. In households without servants, the disposal method was frequently the nearest courtyard, open drain, or street gutter. Nobody framed this as a crisis because it was simply Tuesday. The commode cabinet, a piece of furniture specifically engineered to conceal the pot while making it seem like an elegant nightstand, was considered a mark of domestic refinement. They hid the pot in furniture and called it tasteful. The bedroom was a sanctuary the same way an airplane lavatory is technically a private space, enclosed, personal, and characterized primarily by a very specific awareness of exactly what that enclosed space is actually being used for. 4. When Victorians bathed. And the frequency of that event is its own separate conversation. The bathtub represented modern cleanliness and domestic progress. The whole family used it, sequentially, in the same water, without changing it. Father went first, then mother, then children in descending age order, and by the time the youngest child climbed in, the water was the color of a questionable soup. Heating water required significant fuel and labor, making it a resource too valuable to discard after a single use. This practice is, incidentally, the documented origin of the phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." A literal warning about water so murky that an infant could genuinely be lost in it, which tells you everything you need to know about the visibility conditions in the family tub by the time it reached the last child. Bathing frequency was weekly at best for families who managed it at all. Between baths, sponge washing specific areas was considered thorough hygiene. The bathwater wasn't changed because the bathwater was the point, a shared communal resource that the whole household took turns contributing to and then submerging themselves in. The Victorian bath was less a cleansing ritual and more a communal soup that the entire family took turns marinating in, with each participant leaving it slightly worse than they found it. 5. Victorian medicine was primitive but well-intentioned. Families did their best with what they had available. What was available was tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, sold over the counter without a prescription, and administered to infants for teething pain without anyone considering this unusual. Laudanum was approximately 10% opium by weight, and it was prescribed for everything from persistent coughs to menstrual cramps to the catch-all Victorian diagnosis of hysteria. Soothing syrups marketed specifically for babies, including formulations sold under cheerful, reassuring brand names, contained morphine and alcohol without disclosing either ingredient on the label. Addiction was widespread and rarely identified as such. In women, it was described as a nervous condition. In men, it was called a habit. Neither framing suggested that the product causing it should perhaps stop being sold at the chemist's counter. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required labeling in Britain, but not prescription. Availability remained largely unrestricted for decades afterward. The medicine cabinet of a respectable Victorian home contained a substance that would require a controlled prescription and multiple pharmacist consultations to obtain today, stored between the handkerchiefs and the throat lozenges, available to anyone in the household who felt a bit off. The Victorian medicine cabinet was essentially a fully stocked bar that also claimed to treat whooping cough, and nobody thought to question whether both of those things could simultaneously be true. 6. Gathering around the dining table for meals was the Victorian ideal of family virtue, domestic order, and wholesome civilized life. The food on that table was frequently adulterated with chalk, plaster, lead compounds, and copper salts. Legally, with no required disclosure, and with the full knowledge of the people selling it. Bread was routinely bulked with alum and ground bone. Milk was diluted with water and thickened with chalk to restore the opacity that the water had removed. Sweets were colored with lead chromate for yellow, copper arsenite for green, and mercury-containing vermilion for red. These were not rogue operations run in back alleys. They were standard commercial practices. Friedrich Occam documented hundreds of cases in his 1820 treatise and was effectively suppressed through industry pressure for his trouble. The UK's Adulteration of Food Act didn't pass until 1860, and enforcement remained inconsistent for years after that. Families sat down to a beautifully presented table that contained industrial colorants, structural fillers, and heavy metal compounds served at the height of the china collection under the gas lamps with the good silverware out. The Victorian dining table was a masterclass in presentation. Colorful, elaborate, and laced with compounds that a modern food safety agency would classify not as seasoning, but as evidence. 7. Domestic servants in proper Victorian households were described as part of the family, fed, housed, and treated with the kind of paternalistic dignity that made their employers feel virtuous at dinner parties. They slept in unheated attic rooms, worked 16-hour days with one afternoon off per week, and were dismissed without a reference for becoming pregnant, including, with significant regularity, when that pregnancy involved a male member of the employing household. Female domestic servants were the single largest occupational group among women in Victorian Britain. By 1881, there were over 1.5 million of them in England and Wales. The attic quarters they occupied were uninsulated and poorly ventilated, falling below the minimum standards. Those same employers were simultaneously advocating for factory workers in Parliament without apparent awareness of the contradiction. Their employment contracts explicitly banned romantic partners, called followers, and any social life outside the household required formal permission. Legal recourse for exploitation was effectively non-existent. Social reform literature of the era documented the situation in detail. The employing class read those documents, agreed the situation was regrettable, and then went home to a house run entirely on the same labor arrangements the documents were describing. The respectable Victorian household ran on the invisible effort of people whose own dignity was considered a scheduling inconvenience at best and an administrative liability at worst. 8. Children of the upper and middle classes were lovingly tended in purpose-built nurseries. Purpose-built, supervised, safe. They were supervised by teenage nursemaids as young as 13 or 14, given full charge of infants with no training and minimal oversight, occasionally sedated with opium-based syrups when their crying became inconvenient, and dressed in wide muslin and cotton skirts that caught fire at open hearths with a regularity that sanitary reformers documented in detail. Death by burning was a leading cause of child mortality in the Victorian era, driven almost entirely by the combination of open flames and the specific clothing choices fashionable for girls. Overlaying, an infant being smothered by a sleeping adult or sibling sharing a bed, appeared so regularly in Victorian parish death records that it had its own standard entry. The infant mortality rate in England and Wales in 1850 was approximately 150 per 1,000 live births. Many of those deaths were recorded under the causes teething or convulsions rather than their actual origins, which means the real numbers are likely worse than the records show. The Victorian nursery was safe the same way a campfire is safe, genuinely lovely in concept and consistently catastrophic the moment the person responsible for watching it turned away for 30 seconds. 9. Lockets of hair from deceased loved ones. Brooches woven from a grandmother's curls. Framed hairwork displayed in the parlor alongside portraits of the living. Victorian hair jewelry was touching, sentimental, deeply personal, and built on a thriving commercial market in hair sourced from hospital morgues, workhouses, and the corpses of people the buyers had never met. Hair instruction manuals were widely published and commercially successful, treating the craft as a respectable domestic hobby for ladies of leisure. Entire books dedicated to hair work were bestsellers. The market for hair was substantial enough that dealers sold it in bulk, sourced from mortuaries, poorhouses, and living poor individuals who sold it for income, meaning the sentimental brooch pinned to a widow's dress might contain hair from a stranger who died in a public institution and never consented to becoming anyone's memorial accessory. Queen Victoria herself popularized the practice after Prince Albert's death in 1861, cementing it as a high-status grief ritual and ensuring the market expanded rather than contracted. The same society that treated the display of a woman's ankle as a near-scandalous event saw absolutely nothing unusual about wearing a dead stranger's hair as jewelry on the way to church. The Victorians turned grief into a craft project, which is either deeply poignant or deeply unsettling, depending entirely on whose hair ended up in the brooch. 10. The Victorian drawing room was aired, dusted, and maintained as the household's pristine social stage. The room that represented the family's status, taste, and domestic standards to every visitor who entered it. The carpets were beaten outdoors seasonally at best. Daily cleaning involved scattering damp tea leaves across the floor, sweeping them up to collect surface dust, and considering the job complete. Wall-to-wall carpets went months between proper cleanings. Heavy velvet and brocade curtains were rarely washed at all. Some households allowed years to pass between launderings because the fabric couldn't survive frequent contact with water. Horsehair upholstery was a documented preferred habitat for fleas, and flea traps were sold as legitimate household accessories without irony. Gaslighting deposited a fine layer of combustion residue on every surface in the room each night. Visitors arriving for afternoon calls were sitting on furniture that housed an active insect population, beneath curtains that hadn't been washed since a previous administration, in a room where the cleaning method redistributed dust into the air rather than removing it. The Victorian drawing room was essentially a preserved archaeological record of every year it had existed, arranged tastefully into furniture, hung with expensive drapes, and presented to guests as evidence of civilized domestic management. 11. Victorians who took their appearance seriously cleaned their teeth with tooth powder, a precursor to modern toothpaste and a perfectly reasonable gesture toward dental hygiene. Common formulations contained charcoal, chalk, brick dust, and, in some products, lead. Application tools ranged from a proper bristle brush in wealthier households to a cloth or a sharpened twig in those with fewer resources. Commercial tooth powders were completely unregulated, varying wildly in composition from harmless bicarbonate of soda to pumice abrasive enough to erode enamel with consistent use. Dentistry was practiced by untrained barber surgeons well into the 19th century, and tooth extraction was the primary treatment available because restorative dentistry was financially inaccessible to most people who needed it. False teeth existed and were purchased by those who could afford them. A significant portion of the Victorian false teeth market was supplied by Waterloo teeth, extracted from battlefield corpses after the Napoleonic Wars and sold to denture manufacturers, creating a documented trade in the dental remains of the military dead. The demand was real, the supply was available, and the transaction was considered unremarkable commerce. Victorian dental care was less a hygiene routine and more an optimistic gesture made in the general direction of a problem that the era had almost no effective tools to address, performed with products that occasionally made the underlying situation measurably worse. 12. The Victorian kitchen, presided over by a trained cook in respectable households, was a hub of domestic craft and careful food preparation. It was also unrefrigerated, open to vermin through gaps no one had sealed, and routinely equipped with copper cookware that leached toxic compounds directly into everything cooked in it. Refrigeration didn't exist in domestic kitchens. An icebox was a luxury item available only to wealthier households, with ice delivery expensive and seasonal. Copper pots were standard equipment because copper conducts heat beautifully, and nobody was particularly concerned that unlined copper reacts with acidic foods to produce copper salts that cause nausea, vomiting, and liver damage with chronic exposure. Meat was hung in larder rooms for days. High meat, aged to the early stages of decomposition, was considered a sophisticated cooking preference rather than a safety concern. Flies moved freely between the outdoor privy, the street gutter, the kitchen surfaces, and the food being prepared on those surfaces, because there were no window screens, no sealed food storage, and no widespread understanding of germ theory until Pasteur's work gained mainstream acceptance in the 1870s and 80s. The Victorian kitchen was a masterpiece of culinary tradition, operating in conditions that a modern environmental health officer would condemn before finishing the first paragraph of the inspection form. 13. Victorian mourning dress. The elaborate protocol of black crepe for widows, graduated mourning periods, and specific fabric rules was a solemn cultural practice rooted in genuine grief and social solidarity. The dye required to achieve the deep, fashionable black was produced using chemical processes that caused contact dermatitis, hair loss, and respiratory irritation in the people wearing it against their skin for up to 2 years. Aniline dyes, developed in the 1850s, were chemically productive but poorly understood. Some caused systemic reactions with prolonged skin contact. Black crepe, the obligatory mourning fabric, was additionally starched with compounds that made it stiff, abrasive, and actively irritating, particularly through the warmer months when widows were socially prohibited from switching to lighter materials. Widows were expected to maintain full mourning for up to 2 years. The social consequences of emerging from mourning early were severe enough that women endured consistent physical discomfort to avoid the judgment. The mourning industry exploited this dynamic with commercial precision. Specialized mourning warehouses in London, purpose-built retail establishments selling exclusively to the bereaved, were substantial commercial enterprises that profited directly from prescribing ever more elaborate and expensive grief protocols to women who were already suffering. The Victorians turned grief into a dress code and then engineered the dress code to be uncomfortable enough that the grieving process had a secondary physical dimension running alongside the emotional one. 14. A feather bed was the height of Victorian domestic comfort. Warm, soft, expensive enough to signal prosperity, and durable enough to pass down through multiple generations as a family asset. The passing down through multiple generations is where things become instructive. Feather mattresses were effectively impossible to clean by any available method. They were never washed. Some mattresses in active use by 1890 had been accumulating skin cells, body oils, and organic debris since the 1840s, making them a 50-year repository of biological material with no mechanism for removal. Bedbug infestations were near universal in Victorian urban housing. The insects lived in mattress seams, bed frame joints, and floorboard gaps, and the available treatments, painting joints with turpentine, scalding with boiling water, were documented with the kind of optimism that suggests the writers knew the results were inconsistent. Airing the mattress each morning addressed moisture and accomplished precisely nothing regarding insect populations. The family's most expensive piece of furniture was simultaneously their primary contact surface with a stable arthropod community that had been living in it, potentially, since before any current household member was born. The Victorian featherbed was a cherished generational heirloom that also functioned as a multi-generational wildlife conservation area. Maintained with great care, never disturbed, and home to a population that had effectively achieved squatters' rights. 15. Post-mortem photography, sitting with the deceased and having their portrait made, sounds like a grim eccentricity practiced by unusual families on the fringes of respectable Victorian society. It was mainstream, widespread, entirely unremarkable to contemporaries, and in many households produced the only photograph ever taken of the person depicted. Photography became financially accessible to middle-class families in the 1840s and 1860s. The cost remained significant enough that a studio visit was a major occasion, typically reserved for weddings, significant life events, or death. Bodies were posed in lifelike arrangements, seated in chairs, positioned with family members, eyes sometimes propped open or painted onto closed eyelids in the final print, to create the impression of peaceful rest or something approaching natural sleep. Infants and children were photographed post-mortem more frequently than any other demographic because the child mortality rate was high enough that a post-mortem image was often the only visual record a family would ever have of a child's existence. These photographs were displayed in parlors alongside images of living family members without distinction or special framing. Visitors to the house would see them, recognize the convention, and respond with sympathy rather than alarm. In Victorian households, sitting for a portrait was considered significant. Enough as an occasion that it was sometimes left until the subject was no longer personally invested in the outcome. 16. Lead paint was a period detail, a historical footnote relevant mainly to old buildings with flaking surfaces, not an active domestic crisis affecting families in real time. It was actively celebrated throughout the Victorian era for its creamy consistency and durable finish. White lead, lead carbonate, was the dominant interior paint pigment precisely because it produced a rich, opaque, highly workable surface that decorators and homeowners preferred over alternatives. Lead compounds have a faintly sweet taste. Painted surfaces, windowsills, and wooden toys were attractive to young children for this reason, and pica, the compulsion to eat non-food items, is itself a documented symptom of lead poisoning, creating a physiologically self-reinforcing cycle where the poisoning increased the behavior that increased the poisoning. The resulting symptoms, learning difficulties, behavioral problems, developmental delays, were not connected to paint by Victorian medicine. They were attributed to hereditary weakness, poor moral character, or inadequate parenting, meaning the source of the problem was simultaneously causing the harm and escaping identification. The UK didn't ban lead in interior household paint until 1992. Victorian homes with intact original paint layers remain a documented public health consideration today. The Victorians painted nurseries in a color scheme that functioned as a cognitive development intervention, unfortunately administered in entirely the wrong direction and blamed on everything except the walls. 17. Homes without indoor plumbing maintained outhouses at a practical distance from the living quarters, a basic solution that at least kept the waste physically separate from the family. In the densely packed urban housing where most of the Victorian population actually lived, the privy was shared between dozens of families, cleaned irregularly by night soil workers, and in many documented cases situated within feet of the household water source. Night soil men emptied cesspits manually, working in darkness to avoid public visibility, and represented the primary sanitation infrastructure for most Victorian cities before sewage systems were constructed. In London's worst documented courts, a single privy served 50 or more people. Edwin Chadwick's 1842 sanitary report described conditions that Parliament initially refused to accept as accurate. Not because their reporting was wrong, but because the reality was so comprehensively bad that institutional acceptance would have required institutional action. Cesspits in this configuration leached directly into adjacent wells. The mechanism by which this caused cholera wasn't understood until John Snow's investigation of the Broad Street pump in 1854. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so overwhelmed with sewage that Parliament itself became non-functional, finally forced the construction of London's modern sewer network. The Victorian sanitation system was less a public health infrastructure and more a cholera distribution network that also happened to produce a very specific and memorable smell. 18. The corset with practice became perfectly comfortable to wear. This was the official position, and it was defended by a portion of the Victorian medical establishment as not merely tolerable, but genuinely beneficial to the female frame. Tightly laced corsets displaced internal organs, fractured lower ribs, caused chronic digestive disruption, and in cases of extreme lacing, compressing the waist to 18 or fewer inches contributed to the deaths of women who practiced it over years. Moderate lacing to 22 or 24 inches was far more common and still physiologically significant. Physicians were divided. Some documented displaced livers and compressed lungs in post-mortem examinations. Others prescribed corsets as necessary structural support for a frame they considered constitutionally unsuited to going without. Girls were corseted from childhood, with the ribcage still malleable enough to deform with sustained pressure. Skeletal analysis of Victorian female remains shows measurable structural changes in individuals who were laced from an early age. Fainting, attributed romantically to feminine delicacy and incorporated into the design of purpose-built furniture, was in many cases a direct physiological result of impaired breathing capacity. The fainting couch was an architectural response to a clothing-induced medical condition, and the condition was then used as evidence that women needed the garment causing it. The Victorian era invented a piece of clothing that made breathing a performance requiring daily effort, and then cited the difficulty of breathing as proof the clothing was necessary. 19. Cocaine was a 20th century problem. Victorian families couldn't possibly have encountered it in a domestic context, certainly not in products marketed to children. Cocaine toothache drops were sold openly in pharmacies and through mail-order catalogs throughout the late Victorian era. One American product specifically featured children on the packaging. Cocaine was isolated from coca leaves in 1860 and immediately embraced by the medical establishment as a revolutionary local anesthetic and general tonic of remarkable properties. The medical literature of the period contains enthusiastic endorsements from figures whose later reputations risked on entirely different foundations. Coca-Cola, introduced in 1886, contained cocaine from coca leaf extract. The amount was pharmacologically active. It was a cocaine-infused carbonated beverage sold at soda fountains to the general public, including children, as a refreshing and healthful drink. Throat lozenges, hay fever remedies, and energy tonics containing cocaine were advertised in mainstream publications alongside household goods and garden supplies. Awareness of addiction potential developed slowly enough that decades of open commercial availability preceded any meaningful regulatory response. The Harrison Narcotics Act in the United States didn't pass until 1914. The Victorian medicine aisle offered a comprehensive range of solutions for childhood discomfort that modern pharmacology would classify not as the treatment, but as the presenting complaint. 20. The parlor piano was the centerpiece of Victorian domestic entertainment, wholesome, educational, and the site of countless family evenings. It also existed in a society so comprehensively anxious about the display of anatomy that the question of whether some households covered piano legs with fabric to prevent impropriety has been debated by historians, with evidence suggesting the practice was real in particularly rigid homes and satirized even by Victorian contemporaries. What is not debatable is that female ankles were covered in virtually all public and domestic contexts, that medical textbooks used elaborate euphemisms in clinical description of standard anatomy, and that female physicians, a tiny minority of the profession, were considered inherently scandalous simply by existing in a medical role. The same culture that generated elaborate moral architecture around furniture aesthetics simultaneously produced some of the most extensive erotic literature in European publishing history. My Secret Life, an anonymous memoir of extraordinary length circulated privately from approximately 1888, is a documented artifact of the gap between Victorian public morality and what was actually happening in Victorian private life. These two things were not contradictions. They were consequences of each other. A society that applied that much public pressure on the performance of virtue was reliably generating a substantial private appetite for its opposite. Repression, it turns out, is an extremely effective creative stimulus. 21. Beyond the arsenic pigment problem, the paste used to hang Victorian wallpaper was a harmless flour and water mixture, an entirely neutral adhesive with no further implications for household health. Flour and water paste applied to paper in a damp Victorian house is a textbook growth medium for black mold, and entire rooms were effectively sealed inside a mold incubator, decorated with expensive repeating patterns. Victorian homes in Britain's climate routinely experience wall dampness from inadequate damp proofing and condensation on cold exterior walls. Wallpaper paste trapped moisture against exactly those surfaces. Black mold and other toxic mold species thrive in wet cellulose material. Flour paste on paper in a damp room is a near-ideal substrate, producing the spores and mycotoxins associated with respiratory symptoms, headaches, and immune suppression. These symptoms would compound those already being generated by coal smoke and arsenic-pigmented wallpaper, making certain Victorian bedrooms a particularly layered assault on lung tissue from multiple simultaneous directions. Rather than stripping old wallpaper before redecorating, Many households simply pasted new paper directly over existing layers, trapping previous mold colonies inside the wall sandwich and adding new substrate on top. The Victorian interior decorator was unknowingly curating a biological archive behind every beautiful pattern, with new acquisitions added with each redecoration and nothing ever formally deaccessioned. 22 rat catchers were a colorful novelty trade, a quirky Victorian profession that existed at the entertaining fringes of urban life, more folklore than functional necessity. They were essential municipal infrastructure because rat populations in Victorian cities were large enough, embedded enough in domestic architecture, and consequential enough for public health that professional extermination was a genuine civic requirement rather than an optional service. Jack Black, rat catcher to Queen Victoria, was a documented historical figure who advertised his services by displaying live rats in cages carried on his person through the streets. A form of mobile marketing that worked because the demand for his services was that visible and that consistent. Rats occupied walls, cellars, kitchens, and sewers of even respectable middle-class homes. They contaminated food stores, damaged structural timber, and transmitted disease through a population that had no meaningful natural predator in the urban environment. Rat baiting. Confining a dog with a large number of rats in a purpose-built pit and wagering on the speed of the outcome was a popular working-class entertainment held in established urban venues. The rats used in these events were frequently collected from domestic properties, which means the city's pest problem was directly funding its entertainment industry. The Victorian approach to the rat problem involved catching them, betting on them, and never once addressing the conditions that made the population sustainable in the first place. 23. Gaslighting transformed Victorian interiors, steady, warm, dramatically better than candlelight, and a genuine marker of modern domestic progress. It also consumed oxygen from the room, released carbon monoxide through imperfect fittings, deposited sulfurous residue on every surface, and periodically exploded. Coal gas, the town gas piped into Victorian homes, contained carbon monoxide as a component. Poorly maintained fittings or unlit jets released it directly into occupied rooms. Deaths from gas asphyxiation appeared regularly in Victorian newspapers, reported with the matter-of-fact tone of a recurring municipal inconvenience rather than a systemic safety failure. Gaslighting ran significantly hotter than candles and considerably closer to the heavy velvet drapes and layered upholstery that defined Victorian interior decoration, making the fire risk a persistent feature of fashionable domestic design. Soot and sulfur deposits from gas jets required frequent cleaning of ceilings, wall surfaces, and cornices. Households with gas lighting had measurably dirtier interior surfaces than those still relying on oil lamps, which is a sentence that should give everyone pause about the definition of domestic progress. The Welsbach gas mantle, introduced in 1885, improved efficiency considerably, but left the underlying combustion chemistry unchanged. Victorian gaslight was the era's great symbol of modernity, which, given the comprehensive baseline this list has established, tells you something specific about how the period calibrated its benchmarks. 24. Victorian children's toys were simple, charming, and safe. Tin soldiers, wooden dolls, painted hoops, and the kind of uncomplicated objects that evoke the wholesome innocence of a pre-industrial childhood. Tin toys were painted with lead paint. Ceramic dolls were painted with lead paint. Papier-mâché toys and doll heads were sometimes manufactured with arsenic-containing paste to deter insect damage during storage and transport. Children chewed them regardless, because children chew things, and no regulation existed that would have required the manufacturer to consider this in the production process. Clockwork toys, mechanical animals, wind-up trains, small steam-powered models sold as educational novelties were not designed with child safety as a consideration. Pinch points, hot surfaces, and exposed sharp gears were standard features of products sold specifically for children. Bright red, yellow, and green paints required lead compounds to achieve the vibrancy that made toys visually attractive. Those were the most used colors in the toy industry. The connection between lead content and the colors that sold best was not a coincidence that the industry was in any hurry to examine. Toy safety legislation in Britain began in the 20th century. Victorian toys were manufactured and sold to the same standards as adult consumer goods, which is to say, no standards at all. The Victorian toy chest was an exercise in supervised hazard management, with the emphasis falling almost entirely on the first noun in that phrase. 25. The Sunday roast was the centerpiece of Victorian family dining, nourishing, reliable, a weekly ritual built around quality ingredients and domestic warmth. For most working-class families, the meat was whatever remained unsold at the market on Saturday evening, purchased at reduced prices because it wouldn't survive another day, and cooked in a communal bakehouse because their housing had no oven capable of roasting. Many urban working-class households had no kitchen range. They prepared their meal at home, carried it to the local baker on Sunday morning, paid a small fee, and collected it. Cooked several hours later. A system that worked unless there was a mix-up, contamination from adjacent pans, or straightforward theft between drop-off and collection, all of which were documented complaints in the period. The meat purchased on Saturday evening was frequently offcuts, aging joints, and unspecified organs priced to move before they became unmistakably inedible. Butchers added water to improve apparent weight, colorants to improve apparent freshness, and saltpeter to improve the appearance of meat that had moved beyond its natural window without improving its actual safety. The romantic Victorian Sunday roast was frequently a community project involving aging mystery protein, a stranger's oven, approximately 40 neighboring families worth of ambient cooking smells, and a significant quantity of optimistic seasoning applied at home before the journey. 26 respectable Victorian homes with indoor plumbing had escaped the sanitation failures that define slum conditions. The better neighborhoods had modern conveniences. Indoor plumbing in early Victorian homes frequently connected directly to the interior air of the house through pipes with no functional traps or venting, meaning sewer gas moved freely between the sewage infrastructure below the street and the bedrooms above it. The P-trap, the U-shaped pipe bend that holds water as a gas seal, was understood and patented, but not consistently installed or correctly maintained. Traps that dried out, which happened in infrequently used fixtures, provided no barrier at all. Sewer gas is a mixture of hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, and carbon dioxide. It causes headaches, nausea, dizziness, and insufficient concentration, asphyxiation. These symptoms were attributed by Victorian physicians to miasma, the prevailing theory that disease arose from bad smells, which led to the correct response of cleaning up sewage for entirely wrong reasons. The miasma theory accidentally produced beneficial sanitation behavior while preventing anyone from understanding the mechanism well enough to address it systematically. Prince Albert's death in 1861 was attributed to typhoid, and contaminated water supply and inadequate plumbing at royal residences have been noted as contributing factors by subsequent historians. Victorian indoor plumbing was progress in the same way a door installed without a frame is progress, better than the absence of a door, but still leaving a significant gap where everything you were trying to exclude continues to enter freely. 27 respectable Victorian women of good standing did not wear cosmetics. Makeup was associated with the stage and with women whose moral standing was considered suspect. They absolutely used cosmetics, and the formulations available contained lead, mercury, bismuth compounds, and arsenic applied directly to the face, sometimes daily, over the course of decades. Lead white face powder achieved the fashionable pale complexion the period demanded. Pearl powder, bismuth subnitrate, was marketed as the safer alternative, though it came with its own considerable problems. Cheek and lip products contained mercury-based compounds intended to simultaneously add color and treat skin imperfections, administered to the same surface in a single application. Belladonna eye drops, atropine, were used to dilate pupils for a fashionably large, luminous appearance. Atropine is pharmacologically active at small doses. It causes blurred vision, elevated heart rate, and hallucinations at higher concentrations. It was deployed as a cosmetic. Most remarkably, arsenic complexion wafers, pills containing arsenic trioxide, taken internally, were commercially marketed and consumed to achieve pale, luminous skin. The arsenic accumulated in tissue and produced pallor by damaging skin vasculature, which achieved the desired visual effect through a mechanism that explains why the women using it seemed to require so much rest. The Victorian beauty routine was a slow competitive poisoning event with better packaging than its alternatives and no mandatory ingredient list on the label. 28. When a family member fell seriously ill, the Victorian sick room was organized around rest, careful nursing, and medical attention. The era's best effort at compassionate care. The medical attention often included bloodletting, mercury-based purgatives, and blistering agents applied to healthy skin. These were not fringe practices. They were standard medical treatments delivered by trained practitioners working from the best available theory. Calomel, mercurous chloride, was a standard Victorian purgative prescribed for fevers, liver conditions, and childhood illness. It caused mercury poisoning in patients who survived long enough to accumulate sufficient exposure, excessive salivation, tooth and hair loss, neurological damage that physicians sometimes attributed to the underlying illness rather than its treatment. Bloodletting remained in medical practice well into the 1860s, decades after evidence of its inefficacy had accumulated to a level that should have been persuasive. Physicians were trained in it, had organized professional identity around it, and were reluctant to abandon a technique that the therapeutic framework of the era continued to endorse. Blistering, applying mustard poultices or cantharides to the skin surface, was standard for respiratory illness, producing second-degree burns on patients who were already vulnerable. Florence Nightingale's reforms introduced hygiene standards to hospital care following the Crimean War. Domestic sick rooms remained largely unaffected for decades afterward. The Victorian sick room operated on the general principle that if the underlying disease was being insufficiently aggressive, the prescribed treatment would compensate. 29 flocked wallpaper, the velvet-textured variety that lined the walls of fashionable Victorian interiors, was a luxurious design choice with no further implications beyond its visual effect. The fibers applied in the flocking process included wool, cotton, and recycled textile waste of variable and frequently unspecified composition. The adhesive varnish that held them to the wall dried tacky enough to capture and permanently retain everything that settled on the surface afterward. Dust, soot particles, insect remains, and airborne organic debris adhered to flocked wallpaper and did not release. The cleaning guidance in Victorian household manuals recommended blowing the surface with bellows, an instruction that redistributed accumulated particles into the room's air rather than removing them from the environment, which is a method that addresses the visibility of the problem without addressing the problem. In households with gas lighting, the sulfurous residue deposited nightly by combustion altered the color of flocked patterns over time. Green flocked papers turned brown within years. The combination of organic fiber, trapped organic debris, condensation on exterior walls, and Britain's reliable dampness created conditions for mold growth within the flock layer itself. Rather than stripping layers between redecoration cycles, new flock was often applied over old, preserving the mold colonies from previous decades within the wall structure. Flocked wallpaper was a permanent record of every particle of matter that had passed through the room since its installation, arranged in a tasteful repeating damask pattern for the admiration of visitors. 30. The Victorian movement to install public drinking fountains was genuine reform, a philanthropic effort to provide clean water to urban populations who lacked reliable access. The fountains were fed by water systems that were frequently contaminated with sewage effluent. The single metal cup on a chain attached to every fountain was shared by every user throughout the day without cleaning between uses. The Metropolitan Drinking Fountain and Cattle Trough Association installed its first fountain in London in 1859 with excellent intentions and pre-germ theory understanding of disease transmission, which meant the cup issue simply wasn't visible as a problem yet. The communal cup continued in various public water contexts into the early 20th century. Water quality from municipal supplies varied dramatically by district, by season, and by proximity to industrial and domestic discharge points. Pipes in some areas drew from sources located downstream of effluent outflows. The push for public water access was simultaneously genuine civic reform and a form of political displacement. Providing fountains addressed the visible spectacle of thirst in public spaces without confronting the underlying infrastructure failures that made clean water inaccessible to begin with. The problem was real. The solution was partial. The cup was shared. The Victorian public drinking fountain solved the immediate problem of thirst in the street while operating a communal biological sample exchange program attached to a chain available free of charge to everyone in the vicinity. 31. Victorian taxidermy was a scientific discipline. The province of natural history museums, dedicated naturalists, and the occasional eccentric collector with a passion for the natural world. It was a mainstream domestic hobby practiced in middle-class parlors across the country, producing mounted birds under glass domes, squirrels posed in human domestic scenes, and elaborate anthropomorphic arrangements of frogs engaged in billiards that were commercially sold as appropriate drawing room decoration. All of it was treated with arsenic. Arsenic soap was the standard Victorian taxidermy preservative. Pelts and skins were rubbed with arsenical compounds before mounting to prevent insect damage to the finished specimen. Walter Potter, a Victorian taxidermist of considerable commercial success, produced arrangements of rabbits in schoolrooms and small animals engaged in human leisure activities that were purchased for domestic display by families who then lived in close daily proximity to the arsenic-treated decorations. Natural history museums of the era treated their entire specimen collections with these same compounds. Those collections remain a documented handling hazard to curators and conservators today, more than a century after the specimens were prepared. Drawing rooms containing taxidermy displays had a third simultaneous arsenic exposure source alongside arsenic pigmented wallpaper and arsenical cosmetics, meaning guests at Victorian social gatherings were inhaling trace compounds from multiple vectors simultaneously while politely admiring the decorations. The Victorian parlor display case was a charming domestic museum where every exhibit was conducting a slow, passive experiment on the audience examining it. 32. Victorian public houses were adult spaces. Children were protected from the drinking culture of the era by the simple mechanism of keeping them out of establishments designed for adult consumption. Children as young as 5 and 6 were sent to pubs by their parents to collect ale in jugs. A weak ale, small beer, was considered a nutritionally acceptable daily beverage for school-aged children because in many Victorian industrial cities, it was demonstrably safer to drink than untreated water from the available supply. This was not a failure of parental judgment. It was a rational response to a water infrastructure that was genuinely and measurably dangerous. Jug and bottle departments of public houses, separate entrances specifically designed for takeaway alcohol purchases, were built with the explicit understanding that children would be among the primary customers collecting beer for household meals. The temperance movement gained significant momentum throughout the Victorian era, partly because the situation it was responding to was real. Entire working-class families, including children, were effectively dependent on fermented beverages as their primary source of reliably safe hydration. The Band of Hope, a temperance organization founded in 1847, specifically recruited children to sign pledges of abstinence. It was a response to a documented reality rather than a hypothetical concern. The Victorians warned children solemnly that alcohol was a social poison while simultaneously dispatching them to collect it in a container because the alternative came out of a pipe that had been compromised since before their parents were born. 33. Even homes without sewage connection managed their waste responsibly through regular cesspit maintenance, a basic system that at least kept the problem contained and periodically addressed. Cesspits in densely built Victorian urban housing were chronically overfull, emptied far less frequently than required, and in the majority of cases had been constructed as permeable brick-lined pits with no sealed base, designed with the optimistic assumption that liquid waste would drain away naturally into the surrounding soil and thereby cease to be a concern. It did drain away into the soil, the same soil containing the household well. A typical Victorian urban cesspit was not a storage vessel, it was a slow-release contamination mechanism. Night soil collection was expensive enough that many householders simply allowed pits to overflow into basements, courtyards, or neighboring properties, rather than arrange and pay for regular emptying. The 1848 cholera epidemic killed over 50,000 people in the United Kingdom, and was transmitted primarily through contaminated water supplies fed by exactly this mechanism. The Metropolitan Commission of Sewers, attempting to address London's sanitation failures in the 1840s, ordered cesspits closed and directed household waste into the Thames, which immediately elevated river pollution to levels that produced the Great Stink of 1858 and rendered Parliament temporarily non-functional. Victorian urban sanitation was a system so thoroughly broken that the institutional attempt to fix one component reliably made 3 others worse, and the smell was Parliament's problem before it became anyone else's priority. 34. Penny Dreadfuls and Penny Bloods were the cheap popular fiction of the Victorian era, crude in production, lurid in content, but fundamentally harmless reading material that served the leisure needs of a newly literate working population. They were printed on acid-sized wood pulp paper introduced in the 1840s and 1860s that contained sulfuric acid as a byproduct of the manufacturing process. The pages yellowed and became brittle within decades. Handling them deposited acidic residue on the hands of every reader. A single copy of a popular issue circulated through an entire neighborhood, each reader adding their biological contribution to the accumulated material on every page before passing it to the next household. Reading occurred by candlelight or gas jet at close range over extended evening hours. The prevalence of spectacles among the Victorian reading middle class partly reflects the volume of sustained close reading done in artificial light that was insufficient for the task. the moral panic over penny dreadfuls, which blamed them for juvenile crime, moral degradation, and the erosion of respectable values. Mirrors subsequent panics about popular media so precisely that it functions either as historical reassurance or as evidence of a very short institutional memory. The Victorian penny dreadful was literature read in contaminated hands, in toxic air, by inadequate light, while seated on flea-inhabited furniture. And the queues to buy the next issue stretch down the street, which says something admirable about the Victorian appetite for narrative even under genuinely challenging reading conditions. 35. The sweeping trains of Victorian women's dresses were impractical by modern standards, but essentially harmless. A romantic fashion statement that complicated walking without causing any further problems. A dress train sweeping through a Victorian city street collected horse manure, human waste overflow, rotting vegetable matter, coal soot, and whatever else. The street surface contained that day and transported all of it directly into the household across every carpeted surface it subsequently crossed. London's horse population in 1900 was estimated at 300,000 animals, producing approximately 1,000 tons of manure daily. The street surface of a Victorian city was not an abstraction. It was a specific and well-documented environment. Dress trains collected material from that environment as efficiently as a floor mop and distributed it throughout the interior of the home on every return from an outing. The dress reform movement, including the National Dress Society, founded in 1881, explicitly cited street contamination carried on dress trains as a primary hygiene argument for shorter hemlines. As germ theory gained public acceptance through the 1880s and 90s, reformers gained a scientific vocabulary for what had previously been dismissed as mere aesthetic preference for practicality. The fashion industry responded to these concerns on roughly the timeline you'd expect from an industry that had spent decades defending the corset as medically beneficial. The Victorian woman's dress was a precision-engineered mechanism for importing the street into the parlor, which explains why Victorian household management guides devoted so much attention to floor cleaning. 36. Victorian children played outdoors in streets and courtyards, physically active, connected to their communities, and benefiting from the fresh air that the era considered essential to healthy child development. The streets they played in were the same streets filled with horse manure, open drain overflow, coal ash, and industrial effluent from whatever trades operated in proximity. They frequently played in them barefoot. Shoes were expensive. Working-class children in Victorian cities went unshod routinely, particularly through warmer months, with direct skin contact with street surfaces that contained hookworm, roundworm, and other soil-transmitted parasites endemic to areas with inadequate sanitation. These infections were not rare complications. They were widespread. Children playing in contaminated soil were the primary infection vector for conditions that caused developmental delay, anemia, and chronic illness across the working-class population. The Factory Acts, progressively restricting child labor in industrial settings from the 1830s onward, are sometimes cited as evidence of Victorian social progress. They simultaneously pushed child workers into unregulated street trades, selling matches, sweeping crossings, hawking newspapers. With no legal protections, no age restrictions, and conditions that were in some respects more hazardous than the factory floors the legislation had removed them from. Victorian outdoor childhood was genuinely rich with physical activity, community connection, and fresh air, conducted throughout in a microbiological environment that a modern occupational health assessment would approach with considerable preliminary documentation. 37 working-class Victorian families handled death with quiet dignity and straightforward practicality. The essentials, nothing excessive, appropriate to their means. They went into serious and sometimes ruinous debt for elaborate funerals, because the social shame attached to a pauper's burial was severe enough to constitute a lasting stain on a family's standing in its community, and avoiding it was worth financial sacrifice that extended well beyond the death itself. Burial clubs, funeral insurance schemes where working-class families paid small weekly premiums specifically to fund elaborate burial arrangements, were widespread precisely because the social cost of dying without adequate ceremony was considered catastrophic. A pauper's burial, funded by the parish, meant an unmarked grave and a communal coffin. The stigma was powerful enough that families reduced food expenditure for months following a death rather than accept the alternative. The funeral industry understood this dynamic and operated accordingly, quoting high prices to families in acute grief, knowing that social fear would suppress any impulse toward price comparison. Charles Dickens satirized Victorian funeral excess through the character of Mr. Mould in Martin Chuzzlewit, published in 1844, demonstrating that the predatory commercial structure of the mourning industry was recognized and criticized by contemporaries with considerable clarity, without that recognition producing any meaningful change in how the industry operated. The Victorians were so comprehensively anxious about appearing impoverished in death that they regularly made themselves genuinely impoverished in life, funding a performance of respectability they could not afford for an audience that would have done exactly the same thing. 38. Victorian households kept cats as practical pest control, a mutually beneficial domestic arrangement that kept vermin populations manageable and provided the household with a charming companion animal at no additional cost. The cats, hunting rats in the basement and sleeping in the children's beds, were simultaneously carrying ringworm, toxoplasmosis, and cat scratch fever, none of which were understood, and transferring fleas from the rat population directly to the family's sleeping surfaces with each successful hunting expedition. Ringworm, a fungal infection, was epidemic among Victorian schoolchildren. Shared hats, combs, and contact with infected cats were the primary transmission routes, and effective antifungal treatment didn't exist. The infected cat and the infected school hat were equally invisible as sources to families who had no framework for understanding fungal transmission. Fleas move freely between hosts. A cat that spent the afternoon hunting in a rat-inhabited basement and the evening curled on a child's pillow was an efficient mechanism for transferring rat fleas, and any pathogens those fleas carried, to the household's most vulnerable members. Toxoplasma gondii, transmitted through cat feces, produces neurological effects in humans. Victorian households with cats, gardens, and no understanding of hand hygiene after handling litter or contaminated soil had significant and entirely unrecognized exposure. The Victorian family cat solved one pest problem while simultaneously operating as an enthusiastic and affectionate biological liaison between the rat population beneath the house and the children sleeping above it. 39. The expansion of Victorian schooling, compulsory attendance introduced by the Education Act of 1870, the proliferation of elementary schools, the broadening of literacy, represented genuine and meaningful social progress. The schools many children attended were overcrowded, coal-heated, gaslit, and so densely populated with unvaccinated children in close proximity that tuberculosis moved through classrooms with a documented efficiency that makes the mechanism straightforwardly obvious in retrospect. Tuberculosis, consumption, was the leading cause of death in Victorian Britain. It is transmitted through respiratory droplets in enclosed spaces. An overcrowded Victorian schoolroom was a near-perfect transmission environment, and the children cycling through it represented a consistent and renewable exposure population. Elementary schools built after the 1870 Act were frequently underfunded. Class sizes of 60 to 80 children in a single room were documented. Ventilation was an afterthought. Corporal punishment, the cane, the strap, applied for academic failure and behavioral infractions alike, was standard practice protected by law and endorsed by educational philosophy. School medical inspections, introduced after 1900 and technically Edwardian rather than Victorian, revealed that a substantial proportion of entering children were malnourished, carrying active head lice infestations, and suffering from untreated dental decay and uncorrected vision impairment. The Victorian classroom provided literacy, numeracy, and approximately one new infectious disease per term delivered by the child in the adjacent seat, all included in the same mandatory attendance requirement. 40. Victorian hair was maintained through regular washing, perhaps not with the frequency of modern practice, but regularly enough to constitute a genuine hygiene standard appropriate to the era. Hair was washed monthly at best by those who managed it consistently, in between applications of pomades, bear grease, and scented oils that managed texture and appearance between wash cycles that lasted weeks. Bear grease, rendered fat from bears, sold under names including genuine bear's grease, with illustrated labels featuring the animal of origin, was a commercially available mainstream hair product throughout the Victorian era, not an exotic curiosity. Kerosene was applied directly to the scalp as treatment for head lice and dandruff. It was partially effective against lice and also flammable, which is a combination of properties that creates an obvious downstream problem for anyone living in a household with open flames, gaslighting, and candles. Head lice infestations were so universal in Victorian schools that fine-tooth comb inspection was a standard and expected parental task, not an emergency response, but routine maintenance. The social shame attached to lice was significant despite their near-universal presence, meaning the shame and the infestation coexisted without either resolving the other. The Victorian approach to hair care operated across a spectrum ranging from rendered animal fat to petroleum distillate, and both endpoints of that spectrum represent an improvement over the baseline of doing nothing, which itself tells you something precise about what the baseline looked like. 41. The Victorian kitchen garden, growing vegetables at home, connecting the family to its food supply, producing fresh ingredients with care and intention, was a model of wholesome self-sufficiency. Gardens were routinely fertilized with night soil, human sewage collected from cesspits, sold commercially to farmers and domestic gardeners as an agricultural amendment, and applied to beds producing vegetables that were subsequently consumed raw by the same household that had generated the original material. Night soil application to agricultural land was standard practice. The same waste removed from urban cesspits was sold in volume to market gardeners supplying city produce markets. Salad crops grown in night soil, amended beds, and consumed raw without cooking were an efficient transmission route for typhoid, cholera during epidemic periods, and various parasitic infections. The connection between raw sewage fertilizer and crop contamination was understood in theoretical terms by the time germ theory gained mainstream acceptance in the 1870s and 80s. Agricultural necessity and the absence of affordable alternatives kept the practice widespread regardless. Market gardens supplying Victorian cities with vegetables operated on night soil fertilization at a commercial scale, creating a supply chain with a demonstrably traceable epidemiological relationship to the city's own sanitation failures. The Victorian homegrown salad was the original farm-to-table experience, with a production cycle so thoroughly circular that identifying the source of any subsequent illness required following the loop back to a starting point that turned out to be indistinguishable from the endpoint. 42. For all its complexity, its contradictions, and its grimmer textures, the Victorian era established the domestic values, standards, and infrastructure that modern civilization is built upon. Average life expectancy at birth in Manchester in the 1840s was 28 years. In Liverpool, it was 26. These numbers were driven by infant and child mortality rates in slum conditions so severe they constitute, by modern definitions, a sustained public health catastrophe. The germ theory of disease wasn't broadly accepted by the medical establishment until the 1870s and 80s, meaning virtually every practice described in this video, the arsenic wallpaper, the communal bathwater, the mercury purgatives, the sewage-fertilized vegetables, the unventilated schoolrooms, was conducted without any understanding of the mechanisms by which it was causing harm. The Victorian middle class, whose aesthetic legacy defines the period's cultural image, the wallpaper, the photography, the parlor piano, the taxidermy, the elaborate mourning rituals, represented a small minority of the population. The majority lived in conditions that would meet the contemporary definition of a humanitarian emergency. The reforms that made domestic life genuinely safer, germ theory acceptance, lead paint restrictions, food adulteration law enforcement, sewage infrastructure, vaccination, arrived in the final decades of the Victorian era or after it ended entirely. Most Victorians spent most of their lives in the conditions this video has just described. The Victorian era didn't lay the foundation of modern domestic life so much as it produced, in meticulous and sometimes beautiful detail, a comprehensive inventory of everything that needed to be completely replaced before the house was actually safe to live in. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.